let's have a discussion about how intuition that's misperceived can lead to cults and misinterpretations that cause problems. Have the unfortunate distinction of hearing the word moloch recently and not particularly proud of it. Don't like that word at all. Don't believe there is such a thing as the Temple of Moloch to start off with, and here's why. The word moloch is a Hebrew word that is related etymologically to the word mleku in Polish, which is similar to the word English word for milk. So moloch actually refers to milk. So there's let's say basically saying it's a temple of milk. Okay, it's also the case that if you know your Bible history properly, you would know that it was largely written in 400 AD under the Constantine administration, that led to the founding of Christendom as a way to rebrand the Roman Empire. You would likely also know that some of those stories were based on verbally attained reconstructions of other people's stories over the course of many centuries. And then when people share stories, sometimes there's a slight change from the listener, from the hearer. So the story passes along, it's not quite the same as it was. It's also the case that some of the stories in the ancient past were propaganda for intertribal and intercity warfare, and we're not blaming any particular group for that because they've all done it. So we can't take those stories verbatim. What you might be dealing with when you're dealing with the phrase, what was the phrase that they were suggesting? Passing the kids over the fire in a some kind of stone chimney that looks like a cow. Might actually refer to is this. The word kid refers to a baby sheep or a baby goat. Okay, so, and there is a Mosaic law, okay, from the book of Exodus that you can look up, which where you don't mix your milk with your meats. So, in a society that possibly ate cow as a meat, like steak, but largely consumed sheep and goat's milk, they would probably have been offended under the Mosaic law to cook the cow or sheep's, sorry, the cow or, so not cow's milk, sorry, the sheep or goat's milk as a sort of broth with meat in it. So you don't broil the meat in milk, basically. It's against Mosaic law. So that's what that actually refers to. Okay? What conspiracy theorists in the 20th and 21st century appear to have taken to mean is so different it's not even funny. Okay? And very, very differently. The consequence of that appears to be associated with language changes or linguistic changes in the English language during the Industrial Revolution, as well as dietary changes. So let's have a look at the history of milk, specifically cow's milk. So so around 15,000 BCE, in a lot of places around the world, there was an agricultural and horticultural revolution where herding animals and controlling them as maintaining a consistent food source became commonplace and gradually started to replace hunter-gathering and lead to the foundation of what they call the city-state environments, or the city-state societies. And so there were several main animals that have been part of that story: sheep, cow, and goat. The relationship between sheep and goat is fairly straightforward. Sheep and goat almost exclusively relates to Europe, Mesopotamia, the Middle East, and the northern parts of Africa. Sheep, however, almost exclusively does not involve North Africa. It's exclusive to Europe. It's exclusive to Mesopotamia, and it's exclusive to the Middle East. So sheep and goat are not stories that you're going to find outside of there in that 15,000 BCE period. It's just that area. As for cow's an interesting one because the main type of cow that you find in Europe in that time is called Bos taurus, and Bos taurus appears to be a domesticated version of Bos oryx. The Bos oryx are distant descendants of a progenitor ancestral species that branched off into numerous groups and a very long time ago, in the orders of millions of years actually, which include the bisons and buffaloes of North America, bison and buffalo of Africa, as well as the cows they associate in Africa with the A2 milk varieties, as well as some varieties of cows that you find in India. So, the relationship between sacred cow and milk consumption in India is complicated. There are parts of India that consume cow's milk products. There are others that do not. The regional variations are often associated with religion. If their religious beliefs specifically tell them that cow is not to be harmed, nor is cow to have products taken from them, then they probably do not consume cow's milk products, like ghee, for example. As a consequence, they may come from ancestral populations going back that far that have never consumed dairy at all. Right. So, consumption of milk, okay, and the varieties of cows vary significantly by region. There is no reason to believe, based on the information available, that the peoples of North America were milking the bison and buffalo. There were groups that engaged in an annual hunting practice, but they did not, typically, as far as we are aware, have those animals penned up in paddocks, milking them, which is a drastically different practice. So we can rule out dairy consumption in North America for the time being. We can rule out dairy consumption across the entirety of Asia. We can rule out dairy consumption as in cow's milk. The word dairy refers to cow's milk here, okay? We can rule out cow's milk consumption across the entirety of Asia, the entirety of Southeast Asia, of course Australia, because there's no cows there, or sheep or goats natively. A large chunk of Africa, you can rule it out. And that leaves you with an issue. Europe, Mesopotamia, the Middle East, and parts of North Africa. So, cow's milk consumption possibly began roughly 15,000 BCE. Some people suspect it was around then because there are paintings in Lascaux that involve the relationship between humans and beasts, which roughly resemble Bos oryx. Not Bos taurus, Bos oryx. And they're from about 25,000 years ago. So the suspicion is that during the agricultural revolution that began approximately 15,000 years ago, or more recently, depending which region you're referring to, that's when the possibility of consuming cow's milk occurred. Once those cow herds were penned up in paddocks, they were milked, but not before that, or highly unlikely to be before that. So what happened after the city-states developed? Well, people who were farming cows, who were outside of the control of the aristocracies that developed in the city-state communities, probably for the first period of their history, consumed the cow's milk and any byproducts that came from that, and sold the rest off to the city-states in exchange for other goods. However, when the aristocracies became imperialised, and you get situations such as the creation of the Roman Empire, things start to change. They had a strict system of patrician versus plebeian. From that system, in 400 AD, with Constantine, you get the rebranding of the Roman Empire as Christendom, and an ideological shift with which to engage in mind control tactics for the general population by referring to them as livestock or sheep. And also, with that, under the feudal systems that followed, varying and regional degrees of cow's milk consumption associated exclusively with social class. Britain is a good example of that, or an accurate example of that, because On the commons, what they called the commons. So the feudal system there operated a little bit like this. There were two types of farmland. There was the farmland that the serf worked to produce crops and whatever else for the feudal system, with certain types of products being available to the aristocratic hierarchies. And then there was the commons, where the serfs farmed their own livestock for their own consumption. In the commons, typically goat and sheep were the livestock. However, in the aristocratic farmlands, there were cows and dairy farms. And so the phrase land of milk and honey typically refers to living like an aristocrat. Having a nice cow's milk cheese is a sign of being part of the upward socially mobile as well. That comes from that because up until the Industrial Revolution and the tragedy of the commons, where the aristocrats took the commons away from the commoners or the serfs, and caused them to be dislocated and dependent on industry for their survival, which meant they went to go into workhouses in London and in some cases became convicts and came to Australia. It meant that they were not consuming cow's milk. From the Roman incursion, somewhere between 60 BCE and 400 AD, and definitely not from 400 AD, with varying degrees of applicability depending on which imperial incursion occurred, whether it was the Normans, the Saxons, or what have you, bringing different versions of that feudal system to them, meant that by and large, for the vast majority of the serf population of the British Isles, between definitely the years 400 AD and about 1800 AD, so 1400 years, there would have been a great population of plebeian serf people or working class people who were not consuming cow's milk at all. And if they were consuming milk products, they were consuming it from sheep and goat's milk. The consequence of that is the immunological profiles of people from those populations were different. They did not necessarily develop cow's milk tolerance in the strictest sense of the term. The way that they were exposed to cow's milk consumption would have been different yet again from the Viking and Nordic populations, which were Christianized later or Romanized later, and had different social structures, so that the way they did aristocracy might not have been the same. As a consequence, those particular individuals might have been able to develop cow's milk tolerance over the course of that time, or slightly more likely to, because of that history. It's actually the case that just about everyone in the world is cow's milk intolerant. However, how that intolerance is expressed varies considerably. When you're talking about allergies and intolerance, what you're talking about is an allergic reaction is basically like anaphylaxis, okay? You don't want that. We're not talking about people doing that. That's extremely unlikely. In the population that does actually get diagnosed with casein intolerance or cow's milk fat intolerance, those particular individuals might get things like rashes or IBS, okay, or combination thereof. Those particular individuals find their symptoms relent once they stop consuming cow's milk products, or casein more generally, which is different from lactose intolerance, which occurs in everyone without fail, due to the inability to produce the lactase enzyme after you grow your teeth. Okay? So as you can see, the vast majority of the population, most of Africa, all of North and South America, all of Australia, all of Southeast Asia, and all of Asia proper, have ancient historical immunological profiles that come from people that haven't consumed cow's milk. And any recent consumption is coming from the imperial period, which is post-industrial revolution. As a consequence of that, there's a kind of iffy kind of relationship to milk. One might imagine potentially, or plural might imagine potentially, that in that particular situation, between the 1700s and the 1800s, when, because that bloody word had to be looked up, when they were inventing their false maps, called the Tree of Life and Tree of Death, there might have been some kind of intuitive reasoning going on with the British authors or the European continental authors, where they were in a time period where, because they were in the Industrial Revolution, and some people who were taken away from the commons due to the tragedy of commons in Britain in particular, and taken to London, for example, to the workhouses, those people sometimes were given rations of a glass of cow's milk. Now, this is the story of the London seamstresses. They were people who were dislocated from their homelands due to the tragedy of the commons and the Industrial Revolution, and were made to work 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, for a ration of one glass of cow's milk, unpasteurised, one sardine, and were paid 1 shilling a month. Unsurprisingly, a lot of those people were worked to death, and their relations migrated overseas. Without having the immunological profile of people who could tolerate cow's milk, because their ancestors hadn't either, due to them having ancestors having worked on the commons, consuming sheep and goat's milk primarily. If any of those individuals had descendants or relations who were in London or the sort of like more urbanised area of Britain at the time, who were authoring books like that or ideas like that, chances are those individuals were also consuming mass-produced cow's milk for the first time. Again, unpasteurised, unhomogenised, full of bovine tuberculosis bacterium, strange antibodies that come from cows, and whatever the heck else was going on, and a whole bunch of coal smoke. Okay, so it wasn't particularly good milk. When those people were drinking that, they probably somehow noticed that subliminally that there was something wrong with moloch, with milk. And they didn't know what it was. Because despite all that, the casomorphins produced by cow's milk made them dopey. Okay, it blocked their pain, and as a consequence, just like the opium dens, the people didn't realise they weren't experiencing pleasure, but they were experiencing pain blockage. So pain blockage became associated with all kinds of weird bacteria and whatnot. Okay, so those particular individuals having no education in epidemiology and immunology, which are sciences that are developed largely in the 20th and 21st century, okay, wouldn't have known that was an option for them. They would have been relying on the operant conditioning associated with how cow's milk affected them. Well, it couldn't be the cow's milk. It couldn't be that fucking simple, could it? It had to be whatever symbolic associations and illusory correlations that the cult that they were involved in were telling them. And so those symbolic associations that they made were erroneous, unjust and unfair as a consequence of the imperial period, okay, of that particular imperial period associated with the Industrial Revolution, involving enormous amounts of racism, sexism, and prejudice more generally, as well as genuine attempts by people of all religions, all ethnicities, all social classes, and all genders, encountering cultural groupings and ideas that were not their own, and experiencing a common sociological problem called cultural myopia, where they were viewing the lenses of other people's cultures through the lens of their own, and subsequently projecting and not seeing properly. And there you have it. Have a nice day. Don't forget, immunology and antibodies come from mother's line, not father's line, and develop over the course of your lifetime. Your particular immunological profile will vary considerably from someone else, even with that particular type of thing to consider. Cheerio.